Dark Souls 3 is one of my favorite games in terms of boss design, and even with all of its flaws, I keep coming back to it every now and then for either casual playthroughs, co-op, or challenge runs. So it was, I began another playthrough, and this time I challenged myself to finish the game with only a broken sword. As always, I created a character, gave it a fitting name, and set off on my journey. But the game does not give me a broken sword at the beginning, and I do not want to learn how cheat engine works, so I gave myself a restriction which would probably apply to future challenge runs. Fists only until required weapon is obtained. It was locked behind Udex Gundyr, the game's first boss, and so I had to finish him off with just my fists. I had not played this game in a while, and it showed. Okay, that was fair. My fists also dealt insufficient damage for the quick kill I desired, so the time taken to kill him was longer than expected. Come on, get staggered one more time. Nice. There we go. Finally, the run can begin. After passing the test, I opened the doors leading to the broken sword and picked it up. Then I did the usual tree skip and leveling and made my way to the high wall of Lothric. I leveled up a few times so I was no longer at risk of a quick death, but I was far from comfortable in my position. Main challenge, lack of range and damage. The broken sword functions like a normal straight sword, including stamina consumption, but it deals low damage and has the range of a dagger without the increased critical hit multiplier that usually comes with it. I ran through the high wall, grabbing useful things along the way before fighting Vort. The rust had not worn off, so it took me a few attempts. As this was the first time I had spent any amount of time in front of him, I was surprised by several moves that I had not seen before. I've never seen him do that move before. But then again, I'm never in front of him at medium range. Whew. That was close. That was very close. I almost forgot that move existed. I also caught Vort in a behavior loop once, which was quite funny. Would you kindly stop doing that? The lack of damage and range certainly made it more difficult than it usually is, but it didn't take long before I managed to defeat him. Next location, Undead Settlement, desired item Pontiff's Left Eye Ring, required boss Curse Rotted Greatwood. I ran through everything as always, picking up Loretta's bone so I could free Grey Rat in the previous area, and Estus Shard, Titanite shards and a few other items. I couldn't yet recall where everything was, so I spent more time than necessary on this level. I had a few charcoal pine resins, so the tree didn't really pose much of a threat. I struggled a bit during my level 1 run due to my low health pool, but this time I killed it on my first attempt. Going back to Firelink Shrine, I talked to Ludleth and exchanged Vort's soul for the ring I desired. I usually ignore this ring, but since I would be attacking a lot during this run to compensate for the low damage of my weapon, I decided to take it to increase my survivability. The road of sacrifices was the same as always. I ran past everything, picked up the Estus Shard and went straight for the Crystal Sage. Compared to my soul level 1 run, it was less of a threat as I actually had health this time. An increased level of patience helped me a lot as I went from clone to clone and then took my time taking down the boss. Due to the nature of this boss, I expected to get hit more often and die a lot, but I ended up beating it on my first attempt without much difficulty. Next area, Cathedral of the Deep. I almost forgot that the dogs in this game basically teleport, so it was a good thing that the game reminded me. However, they could also make it into the bonfire room, which means they could kill Gale. That means they had to die. I talked to Gale, lit the first bonfire in the DLC and returned to the cathedral. The first half of this area has always bugged me, even on my first playthrough. It has too many enemies and it's not worth fighting all of them, so I run through it every time. The same applied here. Longfinger Kirk invaded as always, and I unlocked the shortcut to the bonfire, thinking that he would stay at his spawn point. He surprised me on the way back, so I led him into the bonfire room and slowly whittled down his health with my broken sword. I then went to the rafters to get one of the only 2 gems I'd be using for this run. The Blessed Gem would be infused into my offhand Caestus, which I usually do on every playthrough. When infusing a shield with the Blessed Gem, the stamina drain that came from blocking attacks would be increased. Since the Caestus cannot be used to block, this did not apply. The ability to parry and provide momentary hyper armor through its weapon art while having a very low weight made the Caestus the perfect candidate for an extra utility perk, Health Regeneration, which would be provided by the Blessed Gem. I then debated with my inner voices on whether to use Kirk's armor set, which deals damage when dodging, since my main weapon would still be the broken sword. Ultimately, I decided to keep it as a collection item instead. Then I made my way to the Deacons. The low damage output of my broken sword was bad before, but because of the nature of this boss, it was exacerbated. If I did not kill a target before the red essence relocated to another one, no progress would be made and time would be wasted. The longer a fight drags on, the more mistakes I was bound to make. As the fight progressed, the boss would cast a spell that causes cursed buildup, which lasts long enough to be a guaranteed death. I did not know how it works because in all previous playthroughs I either died to it or the boss didn't have a chance to cast it. Apparently, dealing damage to any one of the Deacons casting the spell would dispel it. However, they would try to cast it again after a while, so I had to do it multiple times per run. The low durability of the broken sword also made itself known here. Due to the number of Deacons present, I would usually hit multiple of them while going for my target, which reduced its durability much faster than I would have liked. I would be reminded of this mechanic multiple times during this run, especially during the second half. This is also the only playthrough so far where I would find a use for repair powder. I must admit, I had a lot more trouble dealing with this boss than I had anticipated, but with enough time and patience, the Deacons would fall all the same. I then returned to Firelink Shrine, consumed the souls of the Deacons as the items that could be gained from them were worthless to me, and bought the tower key. Now the Firekeeper's soul and Estus ring were within my grasp. Going back to the Road of Sacrifices, I got one of the two NPCs to fall to his death and rested at the bonfire before the other could reach me. Farron Keep laid just beyond it, and of course I ran through all of it. This area has many things going against it: layout, enemy design, enemy placement, and the swamp that slows the player's movement to a crawl. The Abyss Watchers are not among them. I don't find them difficult and I expected to destroy them quickly, but my overconfidence soon made itself painfully apparent. As usual, I had to rely on the neutral Watcher to draw the attention of the others so I could get some hits in. Unfortunately, he seemed to fancy the enemies outside, which meant that he would run towards the entrance of the arena. This made my only viable asset utterly useless, but luckily it only happened a few times. What the hell? And he's just busy attacking enemies outside. Hello? Would you mind? There we go. Focus on more pressing matters, will you? Like the two guys beating you to a pulp in the corner? Phase 2 was also quite difficult because of my recent lack of practice. The rust had not fully worn off at this point, so I was caught off guard when I should not have been. And I dodged in the wrong direction more than a few times. This led to unnecessary deaths, which frustrated me a bit. Thankfully, the Abyss Watchers had a low health pool which made the fight short. I would usually criticize it for making the fight too easy, but since I was dealing very low damage anyway, it was not a problem. HP check, 3 HP. Good, at least I'm still alive. I then made my way back to Firelink Shrine and infused my Castus with a Blessed Gem and my broken sword with a Heavy Gem. This made it scale well, or in this case a bit better than usual with Strength. I had hoped that putting many points into Strength would greatly increase my damage output and it would pay off much later. The Catacombs of Karthus were next. As always, I ran through everything, and the only thing worth mentioning was that the skeleton that controlled the first ball, which dropped the undead bone shard when destroyed, did not die quickly enough. This meant that I could not stunlock it to death and had to chase it further up. A bit of time was wasted, but that was not a big deal. The opposite was High Lord Volnir, who still is not difficult in the slightest. Instead, he wasted a lot of my time as he spammed the same moves over and over, keeping his remaining bracelets out of my reach. I've played this game many times and I'm fairly certain that his bracelets do not break through damage, but rather the number of hits. I may be wrong of course, but that is just my experience. Anyway, after watching him summon his sword just to blow it up repeatedly, I finally managed to bring him down. Get out of here. As I wanted to further upgrade my weapon, I headed to the Smoldering Lake and was reminded of the annoying ballista that guarded the area. There were enough upgrade materials lying around, and since I was here I decided to finish my usual tasks. I got my undead bone shards from the sandworm and that annoying hallway, an Estus shard after briefly getting lost in the demon ruins, and some level of satisfaction from the old demon king. He wasn't that difficult, so I killed him on my first try. My business in the smoldering lake was finished, so I made my way to Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. As always, I defeated the beast on the bridge, which gave me Pontiff's right eye ring. Unlike the left eye ring, it increases my damage dealt instead of healing me. However, the low damage output isn't as much of an increase in difficulty as it is more of a test of my patience, so I did not use it much during this run. In fact, the lack of range is more important as I had to get closer to enemies to deal damage, which put me in more danger. I also helped Sirius kill Kraton on the bridge, and for my efforts I was rewarded with the Silver Cat ring. Speaking of danger, Irithyll is filled with it. In fact, it is a bit of a difficulty spike. I think the enemy placement could have been improved, but since it was the way it was, I was not going to bother with it. Fast forward to Pontiff Sullivan. I played defensively and parried him as always, so phase 1 was easy for me. It's just pattern recognition and a bit of patience. Phase 2 was where I had to be much more careful because of his clone. Sometimes they can act independently of each other and prevent the player from punishing the boss, so aggression and greed is ill-advised. This is no different. I did not expect to take him down on my first try since I had trouble with his second phase many times before. But somehow I had managed to do it this time, though not without some frustration. It took me only 5 minutes to kill him, but all that action had made me a little hungry, so I decided to eat his soul too. With the Pontiff truly dead, I made my way to Anor Londo. On the way, I met 2 player-type NPCs who thought that they could intimidate me with purple weapons without being Samuel L. Jackson. Just like all NPCs, I put what little knowledge I could remember from my previous PvP experience to use and took them down. It wasn't all me, of course, as From Software NPCs aren't exactly smart. The area I fought them in had a massive advantage in my favor, that being the staircase. Ooh, nice! That was totally planned. It took a while for them to walk up and navigate towards my position, so I separated them and whittled down their health one at a time. Although the Silver Knights that followed were a far cry from their Dark Souls 1 iteration, they were no joke, at least if you were fighting them without making use of cover. There were about 10 knights and all of them had great bows, but none managed to hit me as I ran for the elevator. Anor Londo was full of enemies, so I had to keep myself from panicking when running past them, especially when it came to the deacons that shot fireballs at me. I opened the main door as usual, and once the game state had been altered, I used the homeward bone to avoid the bloodborne rejects that usually ambushes players here. Next up was Aldrich, the Devourer of Gods. His high damage output made a difference this time because I was a bit too confident of my abilities after destroying the Pontiff. Oh, the one time I do a challenge run, your melee attack suddenly hit something. Of course. This gave me a rocky start, but I quickly recovered and remembered how to fight him properly. This also took me one try, but it required a lot of patience since my damage output was still not very good at this part of the run. I was dealing less than 150 damage even when I buffed my weapon with fire and hit his weak spot. It took me 6 minutes to beat him and I was a bit drained at that point. Fine then, if this is what you want. I've run out of Estus, are you happy now? I then made my way up and collected one of my favorite rings in the game, the Sun Princess ring, which gave me health regeneration on top of what I already had. So why is health regeneration so high on my list of preferences in these games? Well, it's because I can save on Estus flasks in the long run, but only if I avoid getting hit. I have to improve my skills and avoid panicking if I wanted to make full use of it, which is beneficial in the long run since I plan to do more challenge runs. Irithyll Dungeon was next in line to be destroyed, and Elva the NPC was here to welcome me. As I let this play out, I would like to use this time to make another note. Dark Souls 3 has a few embarrassing dead ends, usually at the end of branching paths. The Cathedral of the Deep after the Road of Sacrifices and Anor Londo after Irithyll are good examples. This forces players to go back and explore the previous areas so that they could progress, which is kind of lame especially for new players, as there is little reason to do so until they find one of these dead ends. However, they aren't difficult to find since the developers have signposted the transitions to Farenkeep and Irithyll Dungeon. They can be seen from far away and are close to the path required for progression through the preceding areas, so it really isn't the developer's fault. As Elva takes his last breath, I entered the dungeon and realized why he invaded me. An area like that must have an extremely foul smell, so maybe the dungeon in his world was even worse than that of mine. That being said, this area isn't very large, and it isn't one I would want to engage with anyway, so I ran through everything extremely quickly. The profaned capital was even shorter than the dungeon. It has two paths, one leading to useful items and looping back to the bonfire, and another which led straight to the boss. I usually take the former first and was about to do so again, but then I realized that I didn't need any of the items that were placed there. Wait, where am I going? What am I doing? The boss is over there, oh my god. So I went straight to the boss instead. Yorm the Giant was a surprisingly fun boss. In the spirit of the run, I decided not to use the Storm Ruler, which meant that I had to defeat him with a normal weapon. Come to think of it, a broken sword is about as ordinary as weapons go when it comes to challenge runs. Anyway, defeating Yorm without the Storm Ruler would usually take quite a while, or so I've heard. This was actually the first time that I decided not to engage with the gimmick, so I had to actually learn the patterns and punish windows of the boss instead of just walking backwards and spamming a weapon art. I mentioned earlier that the Deacons was one of the two fights in the game that reminded me of the existence of Repair Powder. Yorm would be the second instance. Also, not only does Yorm have a lot of health, but my weapon did low damage and had very little range, so I had to whittle him down very slowly. I couldn't even reach the weak spot that was his head, so I had to settle for chipping away at his ankles. So satisfying. This fight took me about 30 minutes and was the ultimate test of my patience for the entire playthrough. However, I had a lot of fun learning his attack patterns, so it's a net positive experience for me. Right after Yorm, the game teleported me to face the dancer, who was currently busy touching herself. I didn't want to intrude, so I returned to Firelink's shrine to level up first. When I came back, I found out that she was just about to finish and that I had visited her a little bit too early. For that, my punishment was death. It would have been nice for her if she could enforce that though. Unlike my level 1 run where I died many times while fighting her, she didn't give me any problems this time. She died on my first attempt, just like Yorm. Next area, Lothric Castle. The knights were a bit annoying to fight with their high damage values, especially when they get buffed by the priests that accompany them. The rest of the level was unremarkable, except for the pus of man that infested the wyverns on the bridge. They aren't usually too much of a threat, especially if firebombs are involved, but my broken sword with its pitiful range was a different story. They can also choose not to stagger when taking fire damage sometimes, which made matters even worse. The curse buildup from its ranged attack did not help, as it just forced me to wait for it to deplete. Since getting rid of one of the wyverns prevents the other from spewing fire on the bridge, I decided to ignore the other one and head straight for the Dragon Slayer armor. Since I've completed this game many times, the high damage values tied to this boss proved to be an inconvenience at best. In fact, the only thing I find tricky about this boss is the timing on both variants of its two-handed attacks. That, coupled with off-screen ranged attacks, made this boss a bit challenging. I beat it on my second try, mostly thanks to my experience with this game and familiarity with the moveset. I lit the bonfire, opened the door to the Grand Archives, lit the other bonfire, and got my strength to 40. The damage test on the Crystal Sage and the sword's performance in the Grand Archives was when I realized that the main challenge was going to be less prevalent from then on. I took a 40-second break on the ladder before rushing out to kill the enemies, forgetting the ridiculous damage values that the thralls were blessed with. Learning from my error, I eliminated them more carefully before dealing with the Crystal Sage. Ignoring the NPC gank, I made a quick trip to collect the Estus Shard and Titanite Slab. Then I went to confront the Twin Princess, forgetting that I could have upgraded my weapon to plus 10. The Twin Princess took me down once, and I wasn't about to give them another point. On my second attempt, I brought Lothric to the brink of death by spamming light attacks, but the game denied me, twice. Third time's the charm, of course. Next targets Osiros and Champion Gundyr. The former gave me some trouble with his infamous charge attack, which deals way too much damage but went down rather quickly. As usual, I got hit more than a few times, but I was able to do it on my first try this time, which was quite the relief. The latter proved to be much more entertaining since he is one of my favorite bosses in the game. Despite his speed and aggression, I killed him on my first attempt due to my familiarity with his moveset. Next, I opened the door leading to Dark Firelink's shrine and obtained the coiled sword fragment. Unfortunately, I forgot about the Firekeeper eyes, which unlocked the true ending of the game. and by the time I realized this, I was at the end of the game and didn't bother to go back and get them. Before I finish the game, I usually finish the DLCs, and this playthrough would be no different. As usual, I ran past everything in the painted world because I don't find it particularly enjoyable. That includes the snowfield leading to the bridge, the Corvian settlement, and the woods leading to the basement of the chapel where the boss is located. Of course, I had to kill a certain enemy on the way, and of course it took me quite a while. Sister Frida was the only thing standing between me and the second DLC. Normally my fights with her get a bit messy, and I don't remember beating her without taking at least a few hits. Since this is a challenge run, I expected this fight to be much more difficult and time consuming. Even though I hadn't fought her in a long time, I somehow managed to pull most of her attack patterns out of a deep part of my memory and pulled through in the end. It took me about 10 minutes and I did it on my first try. So far, I had defeated plenty of bosses on my first try, and it seemed that the challenge aspect of this challenge run had been missing for a while. The drag heap reminded me of two things. Firstly, I had forgotten how much damage enemies deal in this DLC, since I'm used to running past everything. Secondly, my weapon was still a broken sword, so it had little to no range. Both points made themselves known when I faced Pyromancer Zoe and her two simps. I nearly died to the thralls, and after taking them down I remembered how Dark Souls 3 PvP works. For quick weapons, dodging attacks and punishing was a good way to fight against slower weapons, since interrupting their attacks is usually not advised due to hyper armor. There are two problems with Zoe here. Firstly, her weapon is a whip, which means that I couldn't bait out her melee attacks and parry them. Secondly, she uses a spell called Flame Fan, which is just as quick as my weapon, has more range, and deals way more damage. Getting hit by it results in a true combo of 2 hits, where the second hit will always deal extra instability damage for some reason. It didn't take me long to realize that I had no viable options to use against her, so I decided to leave her and run towards the next bonfire. After narrowly avoiding a cheap death courtesy of the not so slightly overtuned angels, I immediately went ahead to confront one of my favorite bosses in the game, thinking that I would take them out on the first try. And so it was that the last demons in existence took their last breath as they fell to a nobody with a rusty weapon. Of course, I took them out on my first try. The inhabitants of the Ringed City probably didn't want me to humiliate their bosses as well, so they had a welcoming party all set up for me. But I'm not one for ceremony, so I simply ran past everything and made my way to the bonfire while thinking and talking about Crystal Lizard plushies. Next, I ran to Shira and desperately skipped her dialogue, not because I didn't like her, but because some stupid level designer placed 3 tough enemies opposite of her and made their patrol path stretch all the way to her doorstep. And how could I forget that there are 3 more that appear right at the end of that stairwell? Oh well, there's a bonfire right beside them, so my decision to avoid them was extremely obvious. I then challenged the Judicator Giant in the swamp for some odd reason. This led to a couple of deaths and a grim reminder of the absurd damage values in the DLC. I was about to stubbornly fight it again until I remembered that it respawns, so I collected my souls and ran past it like everything else in the area. Midir came to punish me for missing his earlier appearance at the entrance of the Ringed City, burning the path ahead and turning my skin a nice golden brown. In response, I brushed his teeth with all I had, using all my points in strength and my broken sword to send him to bed. That wasn't too bad. I thought it would take forever. Of course, since I was not satisfied with the lack of dropped souls, I went down to finish the job. Dark Eater Midir is a boss that primarily challenges a player's endurance and patience. His moveset can be learned from just a single fight due to his high health pool, and luckily for me, I didn't need a refresher. He went down, as always, on my first try with little difficulty. Half-Light Spear of the Church was the next boss in line, and my instincts told me that he was going to be very difficult. This guess would quickly be proven correct, as he was by far the greatest direct challenge of the entire run. Earlier I stated that my journey through the drag heap reminded me of 2 things, the high damage values of enemies and my weapon's lack of range. Half-Light dropped another reminder, and both issues were exacerbated here. Since he took the form of a player-type NPC, he was unpredictable, and because he was placed in the Ring at City DLC, he dealt a lot of damage. What makes Half-Light difficult as a boss in this run is the lack of opportunities for me to attack. Compared to my sword, his is twice as long, just as quick, deals way more damage than it should, has bleed buildup, and comes with 2 weapon arts that are extremely dangerous. He also possesses lightning orbs and lightning spears that further discourage me from attacking. Of course, that is not enough. Some sadistic designer chose to give him a parry-capable shield and 2 painting guardians that can rush the player or heal him whenever they want. On my end, all I have is my experience, some Estus flasks, and a broken sword. Of course, since this boss is a player-type NPC, he is not very predictable, and bosses that are unpredictable can be very frustrating to deal with. Over the very long period of relearning the boss, I managed to discern some patterns. Number 1. When a painting guardian rushes me, Half-Light usually stands back and pressures me with occasional ranged attacks. This allowed me to safely focus it down. Number 2. The second painting guardian only spawns when Half-Light reaches phase 2, so focusing down the first one before touching the boss is a good idea. Number 3. When fighting him one-on-one, I was constantly driven back by his weapon arts and punished for being proactive. So, instead of taking huge risks by approaching him, I resorted to waiting for him to come to me, and then timing my attacks to hit him safely. In the end, I managed to kill him through this method, which required plenty of patience on my part. Oh, finally, get the fuck out of here. Getting rid of Half-Light allowed me to transition to the final area and challenge the final boss of the DLC, Slave Knight Gale. Gale is a boss that I have a lot of experience with, and no matter how many times I fought him, it still feels great. This boss reminded me of how challenging the game could be, and how far I'd come since my first playthrough of this game. I fought him hundreds of times with all sorts of weapons when helping other players in co-op, and my familiarity with his moveset never really went away, no matter how much time had passed since my previous playthrough of this game. Obviously it's not over yet, but damn, that was good. I still rarely ever get a perfect first phase Gale, holy shit, that was so good. After a stunning display of perfection, I made a few mistakes in the second and third phases, which meant that I would not get a solo no-hit run against Gale. I know, how could I possibly fight a single boss a few hundred times and not get a no-hit run? Well, mistakes can always be made, no matter how good a player is, and it turns out that Gale was just one instance of that for me. Regardless, I defeated him on my first try, proving that Gale's greatsword pales in comparison to the almighty broken straight sword, despite being a broken sword itself. I then returned to Firelink's shrine and transposed the greatsword, entertaining the idea of using it on the final boss before deciding not to, in spirit of the run of course, not because I tend to stick to a weapon that has served me well for a long time or anything. Since Gale uses a broken sword, I was thinking maybe I would allow this, but no. After about 130 milliseconds of being in my head, that thought was wiped out, because if I beat Gale with my broken sword, that means my broken sword was better than his. Look at that, broken straight sword damage right here. As usual, I performed the ritual and arrived at the kiln of the first flame, ready to take on the Soul of Cinder. The Soul of Cinder has more moves than Gale as it switches between forms in its first phase, some of which I do not like because of their speed or how difficult they are to deal with. It is also one of the few bosses in the game with 2 full health bars, and that was why it took me a while to defeat it. Well, that and the below average damage of my weapon. After defeating the Soul of Cinder, I finally realized that I had forgotten to get the one item that unlocks the ending that I usually go for, so instead of taking a few minutes to collect it, I decided to say screw it and link the first flame. This challenge run was overall less of a challenge for me due to my experience with the game, especially after the early parts. Eventually, I was able to mitigate the low damage of the broken sword through stats and infusions. The low durability of the weapon was an inconvenience at best, and so most of the difficulty towards the end of the game depended on its lack of range. In many cases, I found that it wasn't as much of an issue as I thought it would be in the beginning, as all I had to do was take a few more steps forward before attacking. However, whenever I was fighting a player-type NPC, it became quite aggravating because they follow different rules. So that's it for this run. If you have been through this, be sure to share your experiences in the comments. Perhaps you have different experiences with some bosses, or maybe you face different challenges, or maybe not. I would like to hear them all the same. Oh, and if you are disappointed by how easy I had it, don't worry. I had the exact same sentiment when editing this video. I promise, the next challenge run will be a lot tougher.